but it is, in some sense, a possible view. But enough about the pessimists. One can also be an optimist and think that science and religion do not ultimately conflict with one another. Optimists come in two kinds as well, that I will call cowardly and bold. The cowardly optimist believes that science and religion are compatible because they are not talking about the same thing, just as quantum physics and literary theory are compatible because they don't even address the same subject. Religion talks about one thing and science another, so there's no occasion for incompatibility. Stephen Jay Gould, in his book Rock of Ages, argues for a position like this. He calls this idea non-overlapping magisteria, borrowing the idea of a magisterium, or a teaching authority, from Catholic doctrine. Of course, as we saw earlier, religions do make claims about some of the same things science talks about, including cosmology, geography, history, psychology, and more. So Gould really has to modify his claim. He has to say not that science and religion talk about different things, but rather that they ought to talk about different things. That religion ought to stay out of the business of talking about the natural world, and science ought to stay out of the business of talking about religion. It's a noble idea, I suppose, but it's not likely to make converts of either scientific or religious pessimists. That's why it's cowardly, I think. It buys compatibility at the price of forbidding discussion. Finally, one can be a brave optimist. And I think you can tell, which side I'm on by the terms I use here. I could have said cautious and rash instead of cowardly and brave, for example. This is the view that science and religion are compatible because they are both avenues of knowledge about the one reality we all inhabit, right? Reality as a unified whole. And the idea here is that truth has nothing to fear from truth. So scientific truth and religious truth will converge on the same picture of the universe. It does require some courage, though, because there will be cases in which the claims of science and the claims of religion seem to conflict. And then the brave optimist has a decision to make. In some ways, it's an inherently unstable position. The fact that religious belief and science seem to come into conflict over and over again suggests that they're not ultimately compatible in that way. They're not both avenues of knowledge about the same spatio-temporal universe. One of the reasons to think that our senses are an adequate guide to the nature of the world is that they tend in the long run to confirm one another. The appearance of fire is accompanied by the sensation of heat and so on. And as I noted earlier, when there is a conflict, further investigation with the senses tends to resolve that conflict. Historically, what has happened with science and religion is somewhat different. When they come into conflict, there is no mutually agreed on method of inquiry that can be used to resolve the conflict. What has always happened so far when the conflict is resolved is that when science has asserted something inconsistent with religious doctrine, eventually the doctrine has changed. It doesn't happen that there's some method of religious inquiry undertaken that resolves the problem. Instead, there's a process of reinterpretation. So, whereas the early Catholic Church believed that the earth was the center of the universe and that was essential to Christian doctrine, now the Church has found a way to interpret the Scriptures less literally on these matters. It is to be hoped that the idea of a literal six-day creation is similarly on its way out, as most branches of Christianity have already decided. Which strategies are open to the Hizmet movement, then? It seems that since they are committed to both science and revealed religion, they must opt for an optimistic stance. So here's where I offer doxastic practice epistemology as a help. So as we noted earlier, human beings acquire knowledge in a lot of different ways. If we consider each of these avenues of knowledge in isolation as much as possible, we can discern a certain structure to them. Take sense experience as a model. We consider it trustworthy. We don't have a lot of choice on that matter, but we consider it trustworthy. And it has several general features that are of some interest. First, it consists of a cluster of interrelated mechanisms, many of them neurally based, that have an experience as an input, a mental event, and a belief as an output. I open my eyes, I see a chair, I believe there's a chair there. So simple. Of course, it has outputs of kinds that are not aptly described as belief-like. They're more like pictures than they are like sentences. But it does prominently feature beliefs about the external world as its outputs. Second, it's a natural and unavoidable part of a human being's cognitive system, and it's firmly established in our ways of life. Try doing without your senses sometime. You'll see how that goes. Third, it's deeply embedded in our more general practices of moving around in the world and accomplishing the things we want to accomplish. And finally, it's understood as fallible, as particular sense experiential claims can be shown to be wrong by information gathered from other people or even from other avenues of knowledge, like deductive reasoning. Following the philosopher William Alston, I will call sources of belief like these doxastic practices. They're doxastic because they culminate in belief, and they're practices because they're clusters of mechanisms and things we do with them. So it's a complicated system. Different doxastic practices involve distinctive input-output relations and involve their own distinctive defeater systems, right? What it takes to show that a particular belief is wrong. So memory produces beliefs about the past. Deductive reasoning produces beliefs about entailment relations among propositions. Inductive reasoning produces beliefs about what one is likely to discover in the future, even when the discovery itself is about something in the past, right? According to the doxastic practice approach, rather than ask if a particular belief is justified or rational, the question is whether the individual practice is reliable and so rational to engage in. So one thing should be fairly obvious, and that is if you want to find out if a practice is reliable, you shouldn't use outputs of that practice itself as evidence, right? So, you know, if I ask if a person I meet is lying and he says to me, "Oh no, I don't lie," I can't take that as evidence he's not a liar, because a liar would have said that too. For example, it's not satisfactory, and this is what people tend to do in the first pass, it's not satisfactory to claim that we know sense perception is largely reliable because it has so often turned out to be right, because it has a track record of being right. Why? Because how do we know that it's turned out to be right? Further application of sense perception. Right? I make a prediction about what I will see and then I see it. How is that any different from I make a prediction from a crystal ball and then I use the crystal ball to see if it was right? So that's an unsatisfactory way of showing that a practice is reliable. Now, this self-checking record of success is not insignificant, right? Because it does show there's a deep and rich coherence in sense perception, right? It tends to produce a coherent picture, and so that's significant. but it doesn't show its reliability any more than a gang of thieves are reliable if they all confirm one another's stories, right? As good thieves do. Also, we can't generally use one practice to show the reliability of another because they generally don't operate in the same realms, right? I can't see that my memory is reliable. I can't give a deductive argument for why memory is reliable. And David Hume showed that you can't use induction to prove induction is reliable. So it's a general problem with doxastic practices. But what we can do is we can look for evidence of unreliability. And this is the key. If a practice produces pervasive, persistent, and impossible to eliminate contradictions, then it can't be generally reliable. Reliability is a matter of producing more true beliefs than false ones, roughly. Beliefs that contradict one another show that there's a falsehood in there. And so if there's a lot of contradictions, then it's not a reliable practice. So that's one of the reasons we can dismiss practices like astrology and crystal ball reading and things like that. Because if you go to 2 or 3 astrologers, you'll get 2 or 3 completely different readings of what your life is about and what's going to happen to you. And that's not an accident. So right. Also, even when they don't contradict themselves, they frequently produce outputs that contradict the outputs of other practices. So this is something that psychics and astrologers and whatnot are notorious for. They'll make a prediction that something huge is going to happen in the coming year, and then it doesn't happen. So our sense experience shows it contradicts the prediction of the psychic. So if a voluntary practice, like astrology or crystal ball reading or whatever, contradicts an indispensable one, like sense experience, then it's clear that astrology has to go, right? It's the one that's wrong. In general, if one practice consistently produces outputs that contradict the outputs of more central, more firmly established practices, we take that to mean the established practice is okay, and the less well-established practice is unreliable. So it's not really possible to show a practice is reliable, but it is possible to show that one is unreliable if it persistently produces beliefs that contradict either itself or other well-established practices. So William Alston, the guy I referenced before about the founder of doxastic practice epistemology, he wrote a book called Perceiving God, the goal of which was to show that that Christian mystical practices are doxastic practice that it's reliable to engage in. And if it's rational to engage in it, it's rational to suppose it's reliable. I sometimes get these words mixed up, sorry. So the way he does that is he argues that Christian mystical practice, he focuses on Christianity just to simplify the inquiry, that he shows that it exhibits all the same general features as the doxastic practices we trust. It's socially established, right? It's been around a while. And this is the key claim, it does not produce, he says, important, uneliminatable, massive inconsistencies, either internally or with more well-established practices. And he says it's also the only game in town if you want to know about what God is like. So he can't produce a direct argument for the reliability of Christian mystical experience, but he can show that it's got the same kind of features as the other practices that we rationally take to be reliable. So he says mystical inquiry is rationally engaged in. It may be wrong, it may be unreliable, but it has the features that make it rational to do. Naturally, there are critics of this approach. And one of the criticisms, obvious criticisms they make is, isn't this argument available to every other religion? That is to say, couldn't a Muslim say, my practice has exactly the same features, and a Buddhist say, my practice has these same features, and a Taoist say, my practice has these same features, and so I'm rational too. Why is that a problem? People can disagree and be rational, of course. Well, it's a problem because they contradict one another, and we've seen that contradiction, massive, persistent contradiction on central matters between practices, is evidence that one of them is wrong. So we have a bunch of religions that contradict one another, and their practices, that means among the practices, all but one of them, at best, maybe all of them, are unreliable. That seems like a problem. Well, Alston, being a wise man, admits that it's possible that adherents of other religions might well be able to make a similar case for their own practices. But he points out two things. First, they may not, in fact, be able to make that case, since it depends on the facts about the history of the practice, which may not obtain in a particular case. It may be that a particular religious practice doesn't have these same features. It may be that one of these practices does contradict itself all the time and is in fact not rational to engage in. Also, even if all these religions can make the same case for their own, that fact doesn't undermine the case for any particular one. In fact, because whatever arguments you had for the rationality of your practice to begin with, those arguments are still true. Those arguments still work. So we're in a kind of an unstable position here, right? If we think of religion as an avenue of knowledge, and we can take comfort from the doxastic practice approach that maybe it's rational to engage in, what do we make then of possible conflicts? So for what follows, I'm going to assume that the adherents of Islam can mount the same argument for the rationality of their religious belief as Alston does for the rationality of Christian belief. In that case, it certainly seems that they have reason to trust the outputs of science, since they have the same reasons to accept science as all of us have. And they have excellent reason to accept the tenets of their religion and their own confirming experiences of it. The acceptance of science is deeply embedded in their understanding of their educational goals. To understand the universe is in itself a good thing, and educating children in science will make those children better citizens. Their acceptance of Islam is the heart and soul of their motivation to engage in the activities of the movement. So, to remain who they are, they must adopt an optimistic stance. That apparent conflict between, apparent conflicts between science and religion are merely apparent, right? That's what it is to be an optimist, and can be resolved. Also, they cannot really adopt cowardly optimism because it's part of their understanding of the revelation of the Quran and the Hadith that they contain facts of the world that science has in fact confirmed. I'm not sure about particulars here, but that's a claim that is made. They must make claims on the same topics if one is to confirm the other. So they not only have to be optimists, they have to be bold optimists, brave optimists. Now, undoubtedly, there are Muslims who are uncomfortable with different assertions of contemporary science. There are, for example, Muslim anti-evolutionists, and some of them are volunteers in the Hizmet movement, but the movement itself doesn't commit itself to that. Gulen himself opposes materialism in general, but he doesn't specifically oppose evolutionary biology, as far as I know. So as long as metaphysical materialism is not a commitment of science, and I don't believe it is, though many sciences are metaphysical materialists. There need be no general conflict there. But still, the danger is always there, right? Whether it's psychology or evolutionary biology or Big Bang cosmology, the danger is always present that science will make some pronouncement that's unsettling to Islamic doctrine. So here is where, as we say in America, the rubber meets the road. There are really only two strategies available to the brave optimist. Either change your understanding of what your religion requires, or hold on to hope that future science will show that present science is wrong. And as the optimist says, truth has nothing to fear from truth, so we should expect them to agree in the end. The first strategy amounts to admitting that we were wrong in our previous understanding of what religion requires. And to do that sincerely, we need to be able to produce a good reason for the new understanding, so that it's not merely twisting the text to meet our needs, right? That would be a shameful kind of dishonesty, and we can't do that. There are, fortunately, honest ways of letting go of earlier understandings. One principle Gulen himself has used to explain passages that others find difficult or even contradictory is to distinguish verses addressed to particular situations from verses that express universal principles. I think this is a great hermeneutical principle for holy books of all kinds. So, the Quran has a general prohibition on killing people. That's good, right? So, in the verses where there's permission in a particular case to kill someone, or a command is given to kill someone, there are always carefully delimited circumstances. We may still have a problem with that, right? But to understand the Quran as saying, generally it's okay to kill unbelievers, say, is a misinterpretation, because they're taking the particular and putting it above the general principle not to kill. So here's another example. I think, where did it go? Oh, so when you're reading of the Quran, say, seems to require something problematic from the point of view of general fairness, right? Here's a case where moral belief runs up against the religious doctrine. So like the example of counting a woman's testimony as worth half of a man's testimony, that's uncomfortable to modern people, and so it should be. A deeper exploration of the reasons behind that pronouncement reveals that it was rooted in circumstances of the time. And those circumstances no longer hold. So the general principle there, you might say, is don't trust the testimony of someone, or rely less on the testimony of someone who doesn't have the proper experience to be a witness in this kind of issue. That we're talking about financial issues. That principle is still reasonable, yeah? It's just that in general it was women who knew less in Arabia in the 8th century because of the social arrangement of things. Now, thank God, women are out there engaging in everything and are equally competent. I'm tempted to say more competent in some areas, but that's just because I'm incompetent in so many areas. So the idea here is that when there's a problematic text, look and see if it's a particular thing or if it's rooted in a cultural matter of an earlier time. Look for the general principle behind it, and frequently that will dissolve the conflict. And that's a reasonable hermeneutical approach. It's not just giving something up as if in a negotiation. Of course, it's possible for a conflict to arise that doesn't get resolved by that hermeneutical strategy. Christians, for example, or at least many Christian fundamentalists, think that a literal reading of Genesis is non-negotiable. There's really no way to see that as a qualification or an exception to a general rule. It's a story, it's not a claim about a particular instance. Nor, I think, can it be understood as a feature of the culture of the Middle East that serves a purpose that can be served by other means. Now, you can argue with these things, of course, but their only choice, they think, and the only choice for those in the same situation, is to maintain that current science is wrong. This strategy is not as crazy as it might sound. I think in this particular instance it's crazy, but because I think there are good reasons to understand Genesis differently. But anyway, the general approach is not as crazy as it might sound, because we do know science continues to make progress by means of finding out new things about which we were wrong before. That's just a fact. So something about current science is wrong. We don't know what yet, but something, we'll find out more. So at one time, the luminiferous ether was a part of current physics, and phlogiston was part of current chemistry. If you don't know what those are, look them up. It's really cool. So perhaps we can be